Assagioli, number one, Assagioli figures very large in my own development as a human being and my development of the spiritual, what I used to call spiritual psychology, meaning a psychology of inner growth that relies on the idea of spirit and soul. So that's how I would differentiate spiritual psychology from clinical psychology and even humanistic psychology. Because humanistic psychology, I feel very attached to humanistic psychology, but you'll find that humanistic psychology tends to shy away from the divine, the idea of God, because I think for the early humanists, by the way, who were primarily Jewish and primarily out of Germany, religion scared them. So, for example, Erich Fromm called himself an atheistic mystic, and I don't know why he had to call himself an atheist, because I read his books and I can't imagine that to be true. The divine, it permeates his work. But in any case, I've never had those kinds of resistances to the idea of the divine, to the idea of God. In my entire life, since I was a kid, I never identified God with religion, by the way. I always knew that, I don't know how I knew this, but I always knew that the divine was beyond religion, as you might say, behind religion, which is one reason I could never be Orthodox or a fundamentalist or something like that, because I knew that religion is a product of human beings who have ideally been touched by the divine and sometimes profoundly distort the word of the divine. So Roberto Assagioli comes out of both the Freudian, Jungian, and humanistic tradition. But one thing he notices that the humanists don't talk about is the will, meaning how much it takes to transform yourself. It's not just reading great books. It's not just being inspired. There's a profound inner commitment to transformation that can be painful, that can be lonely, especially when other people are not committed to transformation. You have to leave old parts of yourself behind. And as I taught during Hanukkah, whenever we want to transform ourselves, there's profound inner resistance. People sometimes ask, where does it come from? Why? That's not for tonight. But anytime anybody tries to do something difficult, including inner transformation, resistance, in the Jewish tradition we call this the Yetzer Hara, the destructive patterns within, will come to bear, which is why Assagioli devotes most of the first half of this book to the skillful will that I talked about last time over Hanukkah. The skillful will, meaning the skillful application of the inner life to transformation. Now, the skillful will requires a notion of free will, meaning that we are not predetermined in any way. We have the choice to transform ourselves, but it's difficult and it takes skill. In the next chapter in the book, after the skillful will, he reminds us that the skillful will ought only be employed by the good will, because a nefarious person can use their skillful will to do terrible things. So now he takes the idea of the goodwill and he shares, and I'll just give you an outline of, we assume we have goodwill. Let's say good people assume they have goodwill. But he shares in the book some impediments to the goodwill. I'll mention three. First of all, he says selfishness, and here he means the natural tendency of human beings to seek out their own interest. So the way he uses the term, it's not a bad word. It's a natural word of the human condition. We need our safety. We need our position in society. We need our income. We need to feel loved. So at some point, we are always looking out for our interests. That's natural. The supernatural side of it is observing the interest itself and regulating the interest itself. The next inhibition to the goodwill, he says, is self-centeredness. And self-centeredness goes more toward the theme of the poem and a larger idea. Self-centeredness goes from our tendency, when we have a theory of the good, to not listen to other people's theories of the good. Now, this is where we see mostly when people have any kind of moral or political differences, even though they believe that their idea is the best idea, their solution for problems are the best, They have the best idea of what justice is and what democracy is. And because of this, what he calls the self-centeredness is when we hear someone with a different point of view, our instinct is to argue, our instinct is to debate, our instinct is to put it down and not use the will to actually create a different self, meaning a self of empathy and understanding. And this is something that I know that I've encountered my entire life when a person will say to me, how can you talk to that person who has such terrible points of view? And as Assagioli says in the part of this chapter, any point of view a person has is a result of their lived life. Everything they've gone through, everything they've heard, everything they've read up until this very moment shapes what they think is real, right, and true. Then they come across someone who thinks differently. And what they hear is, you're wrong, which is an invalidation in a sense of everything they've gone through in life, as opposed to an empathetic, first of all, an empathetic inquiry into how they arrived at that position. And I remember a striking article that I read many, many years ago of a black man, I think it was in Alabama, who would engage in conversations with members of the KKK. And people said, how could you even talk to these people? Well, he shared that in his relationships with people in the KKK, many of them at some point in the relationship would give him their KKK hood. And he put it in a special closet that he had. And people said, how can you talk to these people? And he said, how many KKK hoods do you have in your closet? You can't get the hood unless you're willing to engage and investigate their humanity, reveal your humanity, or the person will have, as it's written here, a bit of a doubt. There'll be a plowed up field. You can overcome the trampled hardness. And how does one do it? As Assagioli says here. Now, again, this is not new to any of you, but there's a will to understand. And this is from the home out into our national cultural debates. Quoting Assagioli, we can often observe the sad spectacle of people who love each other dearly, but do not understand or appreciate the other person's vital needs, and thus causing each other great suffering. The elimination of self-centeredness, and that means the assumption that your view of the world, your view of what is just and good and right, and imposing it on other people, that's what he means by self-centeredness, calls for a complex and skillful approach. It requires primarily the will to understand. It requires the intention to understand and relinquishing the self-centeredness that prevents us from understanding others. And here's where anytime there's any kind of debate going on, and this is deeply in the Talmudic idea of machloket, of Talmudic debate, you first present the ideas of the other person to the point that they say, yes, those are my ideas. Now, what you have in most debate is people talking to their choir and caricaturing the other ideas of other people, and often speaking about political opponents in a defamatory way. Jewish ethics requires the opposite. Jewish ethics requires that we understand those with whom we disagree, sometimes even strongly, and if we're talking to them, be able to present their point of view to their satisfaction, and then present one's own point of view. And again, here is where I prefer humble and modest language. I'll give you a brief example in a moment. So what does one need to do this? This is Assagioli, and I agree with him on every count here. A person with goodwill has a knowledge of the general constitution of human beings. What are people like? What is the human condition? Oftentimes the human condition is pain and suffering and loneliness, and we present a persona to the world But behind each of our personas are oftentimes great suffering and tragedy. Now, we all wear a mask, and that's a good thing. But anytime you're talking to somebody, assume that whatever point of view they have, there's something deep going on that maybe even the person themselves does not understand. The next thing is, and again, I agree with Assagioli here, is what he calls differential psychology. I would call it personality psychology, that other people's personalities are different from ours. I know this sounds a little bit banal. It's actually not. I would point to the Enneagram, the 9 different personality types. I would point to Richard Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, the way people organize knowledge in their own minds, the way they give in different hierarchies to different kinds of knowledge. For example, many people are focused in any political issue on the outcomes. Does it produce an image of justice? Other people are focused on the process. Is the process fair? So one person would say, well, if the outcome isn't fair, the process can't be fair, so you have to only do things for a given end. Other people say, no, justice is not about outcomes. Justice is about a fairness of the process. We don't like the outcomes. Change society, change the law. Now, I hear people debate this, and they debate sometimes with venom, but their values are oftentimes identical, meaning they both value some ideal good. They both value fairness. So you might say 95% of their worldview is identical, but they get furious over the 5%. And I can give you many, many examples of this over my life, which is maybe one reason that I have really tried to develop a skill. That if I think differently from somebody, let them get their word out. Let me hear all their reasoning. And I will often say, may I respond? Here's what I've heard you say. You say, that's about right. I said, now I'm going to share with you what I have to say. You know, some people can say, well, I like to do what you just did. And some people won't hear a word of it. They hear anything different, all they want to do is condemn, and that's fine with me. Sometimes I feel condemnatory people are holding their world together with a little bit of shoestring and glue. Their world is fragile. So reactive, condemnatory people, in my mind, live in a very fragile world that can only be propelled by hostility. Because if they countenanced a different thought, a different point of view, their fear would be their world would completely fall apart. I just want to say here, one of the uses of philosophy, the great philosopher Hegel shares that every viewpoint, every philosophic thought, every political idea has its own inherent tension, its own inherent contradiction that becomes apparent over time. A person who understands the human condition will be able to note the inherent contradiction in their point of view. I can give you many examples another time. And I think that's the indication of a sophisticated, mature thinker to understand, as one person said it to me, the opposite of a truth is not a lie. The opposite of a truth is another truth. That every truth we have has within it an inherent tension, as I think the best way to translate Hegel. So he says we have a knowledge of the human condition, a knowledge of differential psychology, how different people are in the way they experience themselves, others in the world. And then he writes here, empathy. It is so hard to have empathy with people who think differently. Now, he goes into something that I know inspired me ever since I read the book, and that is through an intentionality. It's very difficult when someone disagrees with you, but have an intentional practice of engaging in what he says, the wonder and mystery of human nature, in which so many and such contrasting elements are found side by side. The core of goodness and the possibilities for change existing in the criminal, as well as the foibles and imperfections and primitive drives found in every single good person. We become aware of the conflicts going in these two extreme types and all the intermediate ones, and of the consequent suffering involved, and we recognize it at some point to be similar to our own. Thus, we are induced to drop the ordinary attitude of passing judgment on others. Instead, a sense of compassion, fellowship, and solidarity pervades us. Well, it just goes on for another few paragraphs. And I have to say, when I think about the wisdom work that I've been teaching, and eventually we hope to have some kind of training program for people who want to be life coaches, wisdom work trainers. This will be an essential part of that. This is the foundation. As I keep reviewing the book, there are about 5 foundational books that shape the approach that I give on wisdom. Not mysticism, not theory of religion, but wisdom in particular, and this is one of them. Okay, I want to give you an example, and again, whenever I give an example, I have to share with people. I'm not passing a political judgment. I'm sharing what I'm going to call an analysis. So some of you may have heard that the new government in Israel is a threat to the institutions of democracy. So a friend of mine said that, and I said, do you mean representative government? They said, okay, not representative government, but the institutions of democracy. For example, the idea that the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, would have the power of review over the Israeli Supreme Court. And the person said this is a threat to an institution of democracy. Modeling on the American checks and balances that the president proposes, the Senate confirms an appointment to the Supreme Court, which operates ideally utterly independently. Now, of course, there are politics that permeate all of this, but in general, we have 3 branches of government that in general ought to be relatively independent from each other. I'm not saying we have ever perfected that. I'm not saying we're getting it right. The idea is very good. So then I decided to go look up, do some research about the Israeli Supreme Court. Here's something I discovered that I did not know. How are justices selected? First of all, 3 sitting justices, headed by the Chief Justice, who can veto any nomination. I believe it's 2 members of the Israeli parliament, one of which has to be the Minister of Justice, and then 2 members of the Israeli Bar Association. There's one other, and I'm skipping, maybe 3 members of parliament. So 3 sitting justices, 3 ministers of state, and by the way, not every minister of state has to be elected, and 2 members of the Israeli Bar Association. So I took a big pause. The justices, by the way, they are not vetted by the Knesset, so they don't go through a confirmation process. Those people, I think it's 9 in total, they appoint to the Israeli Supreme Court. I'm not saying it's wrong. It might be great, but it gave me pause to think that what if the Supreme Court justice was someone that I detested and they had veto power over any nominee? And then a third of them were the current Supreme Court, I believe selected by the Chief Justice. So it's basically a replicating institution. 2 members of the Israeli Bar Association, that surprised me. 3 members of parliament, and a lot of custom involved as well. Now, this might be an ideal institution of democracy. It might be. And to propose the idea that the elected parliament of the people should review a court decision might be a travesty. I just want to share with you, it wasn't so obvious to me. It wasn't so obvious to me because I'm familiar with the American model that the elected representatives, meaning the Senate, get to question any nominee. Now, again, it's going to be a political vote, as we've all seen in recent history, but at least they're vetted and they're asked questions by the representatives of the people. Now, I grew up here. I know American law very well. It always seems to me to be, well, that's obviously right because this is what I know. It's America. I've read about systems in other countries, and it's really interesting for me how I think there is in every liberal state, representative democracy with concerns for the rights of the minorities. I think there is a search for justice, but how fascinating it is how differently systems of justice are arranged, and the idea that the legislature, the Congress here, Senate, House of Representatives, are allowed to question and confirm, which is not the case in Israel. So I brought this up to my friend, and my friend knew all of this, but it's as if they were so committed, and this is where some pain, to calling the current incoming government in Israel, calling them fascist. So one thing I asked of my friend is, please don't do that. I taught Holocaust for 10 years. I know what happened under fascism. I would call Mao and Stalinism a kind of a fascism. It wasn't the benign sharing of goods, the communal pot in which all goods are placed and shared equally. One could call that communism. What we saw in the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union was not the ideal of shared goods. We all know that. It was really based on mass murder, as bad as Nazism. So I consider all three to be fascist, including Imperial Japan. So when I think of fascism, I think what the Japanese did to the Chinese. I think what Mao and Stalin did to their own people. I think what Nazism did. I call that fascism. So to call the incoming government, even though we may not like their policies and really be distasteful of the policies, to call them fascist, I think, is so beyond the pale of reasonable language. And I want to add one thing to it. We know many people, and this is people who live outside of Tel Aviv. They live in, I would say, not say the suburbs, but you might say, I'll give an example, Central California. So people in Tel Aviv typically don't know those people, but we know them. Some of them are family friends, and some of them are connected to our daughters who served in the army. And remember, the army in Israel is a great melting pot. And when you look at the soldiers who actually serve actively, I think it was 65 to 75% of the soldiers, active soldiers, voted for the incoming government, even though a tiny percent of them are Orthodox. And when they asked why, they said, we want someone who backs us up. Right. Now, I'm not saying they're right or wrong, but they're not fascists. They're not bad people. I'm going to speak for the Jewish people. They're our children. And they've been drafted and put in a very difficult situation. And the idea that we're going to call them fascists, it's heartbreaking to me. Now, I'm not saying there isn't an authentic debate and something moral is at stake. And an institution of democracy has to be examined, and the right thing has to be done. But from my perspective, don't start with the word fascist. Don't start with what Assagioli would call your self-centeredness, which is my view is right. I don't even need to hear your point of view, which sadly is taking place among the leadership in American Jewry today. And there are voices, and I want to especially congratulate my colleague, Rabbi David Wolpe of Sinai Temple. In his writing, he is affirming this idea of Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim Chaim. These and these are the word of the living God. Let's hear what the other side has to say. Don't start with a foregone conclusion, and don't start by name calling. So this is actively happening now, and I'm in what I hope to be friendly and edifying conversation with colleagues. And what I hope to do is bring the rhetoric down, stop the name calling, clearly define what's at stake, and what we're going to do about it without defaming and insulting people, coming from what Assagioli would say, the natural self-centeredness to think that your morals, your processes are right without ever hearing what another person who differs with you has to say. Now, I've taught about this many, many times over my profession. I've done sessions on this online for our synagogue and other synagogues. I want to share with you, what I'm sharing with you tonight is not my opinion. It is embedded in the Jewish ethics of what's called machloket, or debate over any kind of issue. It's called the ethics of machloket, the ethics of debate enshrined in the Talmud, enshrined in our tradition. And the appeal that I'm making, and it goes so much with the poem that Shanti read tonight, so much with Assagioli. Let's try to cultivate empathy, understanding. That does not mean the sacrifice of our principles. That doesn't mean the sacrifice of our point of view. But when we conduct this discussion with other people, we want to come out with everybody's humanity intact, even though we might hope that they don't get their way. And there are many people who might debate that I hope they don't get their way. But I want the humanity of the conversation to be maintained.